See it.
That's a long time.
So in 3 weeks, I'm going to review the ratings. Yes. Is that Barbara? Okay, I'll go into it. So you do a PowerPoint or not, which is kind of that's definitely okay.
Well, welcome everybody to Book Sandwich Din.
Oh, God.
This is our first Book Sandwich Din for the season, for the 2023-24 season. And I'd like to introduce our book reviewer, Reverend Holly Williams Strickland, who will be reviewing the book Vigilance, The Life of William Still, the father of the Underground Railroad, by Andrew Diemer. Holly Strickland was born in Elmira and graduated from Elmira Free Academy. She's currently a candidate for the Doctor of Ministry degree at Colgate Rochester Crozer Divinity School. She's a published writer, including Mother Muse, a collection of stories on motherhood, and she has written articles on literacy for the Star Gazette. She's the founder and CEO of Shalom Education Foundation, Nairobi, Kenya, East Africa, and creator of the Parents Have Power blog. Welcome, Reverend Strickland.
Thank you. Thank you, and welcome everyone. This is exciting. I was so excited to get the invitation to be a part of the Book Sandwiched In program. So I hope that you learned something. I hope that you are able to get some clarification about some of the history that includes Elmira, even if it's a little bit of inclusion for Elmira. I'm glad that we're able to share this afternoon. The book is titled Vigilance, The Life of William Still, father of the Underground Railroad, and as was mentioned, Andrew Diemer is the author. And I thought about the title, Vigilance. Sometimes you hear the word vigilante. But vigilance is an action or a state of keeping careful watch. You're looking out for possible danger or difficulties. And in that case, and in that note, this title is an excellent representation of the character, the person that we're talking about today, William Still. Who was William Still? William was born a free man to parents who had been enslaved, and the childhood of Still was one of great difficulty, but it has an amazing family story. William Still was born October 7th, 1821, in a remote corner of the southern New Jersey pines. He was the youngest of 18 children of Levin and Charity. Charity was also called Sidney, and the last name is Still. His parents were born into slavery, and when Levin was 24 years old, who would be Still's father, after years of hard work and sacrifice, he was able to buy his freedom and head north to New Jersey. He had to leave his wife and their 4 children behind as they were still enslaved by a different slave owner. Sidney, the wife, the mother, escaped several times. However, she was often found by a gang of slave catchers, and they returned her and her children back to the owner. But once she decided to escape again, this time she took only the infant girls and left the 2 boys behind. When the slave owner discovered that Sidney had fled again, he sold the 2 boys, ages 8 and 6, to a plantation in Lexington, Kentucky. Levin and Peter had no idea what had become of their mother. She just was not there. She joined Levin, who changed their name from Steele to Still, and they moved to a remote section of southern New Jersey. And here's the miracle story. A man named Peter Friedman is guided to an office in Philadelphia known as the Anti-Slavery Society office. And he sees a young black man neatly dressed with short cropped hair and strong features sitting at the desk. Peter was concerned that the city of Philadelphia looked nothing like it had in his memory. Would he even recognize his parents? It was more than 40 years ago, and he remembered his brother's face and would look at each dark face that passed, hoping to see some resemblance. So as Still begins to question him in the office, Peter shares that he was stolen away from the Delaware River area with his brother when he was about 6 years old. He had 2 sisters. And when his brother died 19 years ago, Peter brought his freedom and returned to search for his family in this area. William Still began searching through his office files, looking for information about the names that Peter remembered while growing up. It was going to take a while, so Still told the guide to leave Peter there and promised to take him back to where he was staying when they finished searching. The guide left, and Peter was skeptical about staying there alone, but he remained. Here is the miraculous part of the story. From the names that Peter had shared, Still realized that the man sitting in front of him had the same name as his parents, and he had 2 sisters. Peter Friedman was his long-lost brother. Still sat down next to Peter and said, "Supposing I should tell you that I am your brother." An incredulous Peter, who had been searching for years, said, "Suppose you should." "Well," Still continued, his voice trembling, "from all that you have told me, I believe that you are a brother of mine. My father's name was Levin. My mother's name was Sidney, and they lost 2 boys named Levin and Peter about the time you speak of. I have often heard my mother moan and mourn about those 2 children, and I am sure you must be one of them." And that is how Still found his family and motivated him to continue to help people find long-lost family members and fugitives from slavery. It was the kind of work that he would do for most of his life. What did William Still do? Still had always known about his family's connection to slavery, and from an early age he was drawn to the anti-slavery struggle. His work in that struggle has often been overlooked. As remarkable as Peter's appearance in his office seemed to both men, it was no coincidence. Still had placed himself in the center of a vast network of men and women who were committed to aiding fugitives from slavery to their dangerous flight north. This network was built on word of mouth, on carefully compiled records, on letters and telegraph wires, on steamship lines, railroad tracks, and country roads, all converging on Still and the anti-slavery office in Philadelphia. While Still's work would sometimes bring him face to face with an enemy, an arrogant slave owner on the Delaware docks or a slave catcher in a Philadelphia back alley, most often his work found him as he was that night when Peter walked in, seated at his desk, writing and keeping records. Still was an ordinary man who did extraordinary things. This explains why we know less about him than we do his better-known contemporaries. For example, Frederick Douglass was born just a few years before Still in the same region of Maryland's Eastern Shore, where Still's parents had been enslaved. Douglass was extraordinary by any standard, and his vivid prose and oratorical style made him an international star of the abolitionist movement. However, Douglass would also help ferry fugitives across the border to Canada, fugitives who often had been sent from Philadelphia by Still. Many of these fugitives would never have made it to Douglass had it not been for Still's work in Philadelphia. Harriet Tubman was also born enslaved in the same region of Maryland. She was to become one of the most famous figures of the Underground Railroad. Her almost superhuman physical courage enabled her to travel into the lion's den to rescue friends and family while facing re-enslavement and even death. Tubman was only one of the innumerable conductors with whom Still worked, shepherding fugitives to safety. Still's work linked these two and countless more like them in a vast abolitionist web to aid hundreds of desperate fugitives from slavery. Where did he impact? Still's work was accomplished and impacted so many because it organized and empowered the everyday work of fugitive slaves, their struggles for freedom, and their flight from bondage. Even the great city of Elmira was impacted by Still's work. At one point, Still believed that informants had compromised the route between Philadelphia and New York City. He had evidence that slave catchers had been alerted of 3 fugitives and had actually boarded the train on which the fugitives had been riding. Still was convinced that his leg of the Underground Railroad had become unsound. For some time after, whenever possible, he avoided routing fugitives via New York City, and instead he would send them directly to Elmira in western New York. And that information and story can be found on page 109 in the book. In 1872, Still published his monumental amount of work. The Underground Railroad was the title. Almost 800 pages, telling the stories of hundreds of fugitives he helped on their way north. For those looking to recover Still's actions, this book has proven to be frustrating. And the reason was, Still did not want to be the center of attention. In fact, for many of those pages at a time, it can be difficult to find Still's hand at all. His absence is by design. Still understood and wanted his readers to understand that fugitive slaves themselves were the engine of the Underground Railroad. Still's work shows us that enslaved people were prepared to save themselves. They simply needed a helping hand. That hand would come primarily from the grassroots efforts of African American families who opened their arms and their homes to fugitive slaves. To be sure, there were white allies who helped in this work as well, but it was the willingness of black communities across the North to harbor fugitive slaves upon which Still most relied. Still's work would eventually tie together hundreds of communities, stretching all the way across the border of Canada. Still's life is a story of the triumph of the heroic lone individual. It is a story of community struggle and of one man's critical part in the struggle. How did he do it? Still's life helps us to see the longer story of the fight for black freedom and black citizenship rights. As central as his Underground Railroad work would be to Still's life, it would prove to be only a part of his longer fight for the rights of black people. The end of slavery in the North would leave free African Americans as second-class citizens, generally denied the right to vote, excluded from most of the best-paying work, segregated in public accommodations, and insufficient schools. Abolitionism was the beginning, not the end, of the struggle for black freedom. Even as he was engaged in the everyday work of assisting fugitive slaves fleeing from the South, Still also committed himself to the fight for full black citizenship. He understood that these struggles were bound together. And why did he do it? What was Still's why? Throughout all his work, Still was also a son, a father, and a husband. Yet for a black man in the 19th century of America, Each of these roles were necessarily weighted with ideological and political significance. Free Black people daily confronted a white majority that assumed them to be lazy, undisciplined, intemperate, and generally a threat to their community. Black leaders disagreed about the exact origins of this overwhelming prejudice, but Black leaders understood that it was the responsibility of each individual to live a life that disproved these destructive and harmful lies. For still, this meant hard work, prudence, and a lifelong pursuit of the respectability that came with material success. Eventually, Still would prosper, becoming one of the wealthiest Black men in Philadelphia, mostly due to his success as a coal dealer. Economic success would enable Still and his wife, Letitia, to live in increasing comfort, to provide their children with opportunities they had been denied, and to share their wealth with the Black community. In a sense, Still's story is a classic 19th century rags to riches story. Still never lost sight of those who had made his success possible and continued to help the community. He sought to turn his success into an argument for the inherent value of Black people, who Still reminds us continue to struggle against great odds in their efforts to secure for themselves and their families what white Americans take for granted. Black abolitionist and author William Wells Brown wrote this of his friend William Still: "It is safe to say that no man has been truer to the fleeing slave than he." Still's contemporaries understood him to be one of the most important figures in the abolitionist movement. Upon his death, newspapers across the country remembered him as the father of the Underground Railroad. If we think of a father as one who nurtures, protects, guides, and shapes, then Still does deserve to be called that. He was one of the leading Black men of the 19th century. In the more than 100 years since his death, Still has been marginalized, even forgotten, by the histories of movements to which he contributed so much and the seemingly mundane nature of his work on the Underground Railroad. The book Vigilance by Andrew K. Diemer seeks to remedy that erasure and return Still to his rightful place at the center of the struggle against enslavement. Thank you. I will try to answer any questions, but before we do that, I just also want to remind people that the table here in the front has copies of the book, Vigilance. If anyone is interested, they are free to take a copy, first come, first served. And if you would like, you may decide to leave a donation, and the donation will be used with the education program for the Chemung County Historical Society, where the educator, Susan, goes into the schools and shares information, history, artifacts about local history and also national history. So please take a copy of the book and enjoy the message. Are there any questions? I know it might be a little hard because some of you have not read the book and are interested in reading it now. Yes?
What was Philadelphia like during the time of William Still? What was the atmosphere in Philadelphia like? And what was William Still's challenges in Philadelphia at that time?
It seems as though Philadelphia was becoming quite the city, the go-to city. A lot of people coming up from the South would arrive in Philadelphia knowing that there was the possibility, because of the fugitive slave law, there was a possibility they would be captured and sent back to the South and to owners. But Philadelphia became like a mecca, and it was full of hustle and bustle. There were people who were just arriving, there were established families, business owners, and in part, I think, what Still had to realize was who could be trusted, who could be included in this vast network, as well as being aware of the dangers, not only to him but to his family and the people in his network. So I just think it was a large city atmosphere, a lot of people coming and going, and being a part of a big city with all that involves. There were people who were on the level, there were people who were trying to scam people and make money by accusing freed people of being slaves and taking them back to the South. There's a lot in the book about the different court cases where people would be abducted off the street, black people would be abducted by people who said, well, you were my slave and you escaped, and so I'm going to take you back. But they were free, and it was hard for the court to really understand and to recognize that this was part of people just trying to make money and improve their lifestyle. Yes?
Why did William try to avoid going to New York City? What was the situation there?
According to the story in the book, again, it was a matter of trust, and there were people who would gain information about what fugitives were coming through on the train or other forms of transportation. And so there were times when Still found out that the people he thought were a part of helping people were not in it for the right reason. And so there were groups of people who would intentionally find a way to see how they could get fugitives and get them back and earn money off of them. So when Still found out that there were informants among them and got information about them actually being on some of the trains where the fugitives were being placed, he decided to change and use Plan B and would detour people to Elmira rather than into New York City. So they wouldn't stop in New York City, they would just keep going. And Elmira was his stopping point. And then they would go north from there. Someone else here.
Hi, Holly, it's Donna. Nice
Hi,
to see
Donna.
you. Thank you very much. Somewhere I read a communication between John Jones and William Still. It's not in this book, I gather, but I know they did communicate, and I wondered if you know anything about that and could talk
That came
about
up in the book study, and I believe it was Talima Aaron, who is the president of the John Jones Museum, shared that there was correspondence and communication between the two of them. So that's another Elmira point that impacts his story. Yes.
I just wonder if Philadelphia's environment with the peaceful Quakers had an influence over choosing that city to do his work in.
That's a good point, and yes, they did. Also in the book, it shared the early years of Still's parents, Levin and Sidney. When they escaped, they were able to get to areas that were predominantly Quaker communities, and that's where they received a lot of support, a lot of help through their journey. So the Quakers did play an important part in helping. Anyone else? Yeah, Jenny.
Do we know the route that was taken by the enslaved people from Philly to Elmira? It was something that they traveled by foot?
By foot or by train.
Or by train, okay. following the Susquehanna and then the Chemung River. That's what I have been told, but I wondered if you had any more.
That seems to be the route. There was no GPS.
Right.
So basically it was, how can I get from point A safely to point B? And so it was probably a zigzaggy type of journey. Yes.
I think that Olivia Langdon and the Javits family were involved with the Underground Railroad. And where my husband practiced his dental office, that building, when we had it renovated, one of the architects said there was a room that was just big enough for someone to hide in. And I did a little research at the Historical Society, and there was an old map detailing some underground trails that were used. And it looked to me like one of them went right through this house. So are you familiar with any of their involvement with the underground railroad?
Their names have come up in other discussion groups and book studies. It did come up when we were at the Historical Society. Elmira is rich with a history of supporting and being a part of the Underground Railroad. I'm sure just about everyone in the room is familiar with the Park Church and the role that the church played. There are other places I know. At the book study earlier, someone mentioned that near Jerusalem Hill, there was a home, and that was where people would wait and hide until it was safe to move on. So Elmira played an important part. Jenny?
And I would just also mention, if you haven't been to Woodlawn Cemetery to see the monument there that lists both black and white abolitionists in Elmira, and it locates their graves. So if you haven't done that as a field trip, that's really great.
That's a good point. Yes.
I researched homes in the near west side neighborhood, and there are a number of them there that have, that were on the Underground Railroad, on West Water Street in particular. And they'll have a cistern in the, or someplace in the basement where they hid the slaves. So there are definitely places that are identified homes where they were kept.
Right, and the architecture of the homes created space where people could be hidden, secret parts of the floor where they could go down into the cellar and things like that. So, yeah. And when you think about it, the proximity of the Chemung River, if that was part of the passage route, that would be accessible. We didn't have all the streets and houses and buildings that we see now. It was probably open spaces with houses along the way, and so that was a way for them to come up from the river and be a part of the Underground Railroad in West Elmira, Park Church area. So it does make sense. Yes.
So I have just a story about Underground Railroad. I also have a question that I want to follow up with. The story is that there was, in pre-Civil War time, there was a Baldwin family in the area. And some of the descendants of the Baldwin family, as I understand it, grew up in a house near Jerusalem Hill, or at the foot of Jerusalem Hill, that actually had a tunnel that led off of the basement. And they could never get all the way through it, so they don't know where it went to, but they know that it was there. So that's a story that I have heard. The question that I have specifically is, I know that you do some Harriet Tubman work, and I'm wondering if through that, do you know what William Still's connection with Harriet Tubman is, more specifically?
Well, that's a two-point question. I do a portrayal of Harriet Tubman, and I present her story dressed as Harriet Tubman, and I visit classrooms, and different organizations have asked me to come in and share. So yes, I do that. I have not really delved into the specifics of your question, but that would be a good added feature to be able to share where in the area locally Harriet Tubman interacted with people. We do know the Frederick Douglass Memorial AME Zion Church did have visits from Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass. So I wouldn't be surprised if possibly William Still visited this area. Maybe not, but it would be nice to think that he actually walked some of the spaces of Elmira as part of his mission. But I'll get back to you on that. Anyone else? It's an interesting book. It covers a lot of history and just anecdotes and stories that aren't as well known about William Still. He didn't go around saying, you know, I'm the father of the Underground Railroad, but people knew of his work, and he had partnerships with business people. There were different organizations in the community that helped to fund and hide and help out so that as many people as possible could head north and obtain freedom. So if you have any you know, just downtime, you need a good book by your nightstand, this might be one that will catch your fancy. Yes?
Once the war was over, what happened there to Mr. Still?
Are you talking about the Civil War?
Yes.
He remained in the Philadelphia area and became one of the wealthiest black men in the area. He owned several, he dealt with coal, and he owned several stores that supplied coal to families and companies. His children, as it said earlier, were able to have a lot of the opportunities and the benefits that came from his work and his business. So they were able to lead an even better life than the parents and the grandparents. Yes?
Is there a monument or a place where they have honored Stillman in Philadelphia?
You know, I'm not quite sure. I'm thinking maybe in Philadelphia there's a statue or some type of recognition, but I'm not sure. There should be, yeah. Yes.
I understand that he was a pretty good record keeper. Is there any documentation about how many people actually filtered through Philadelphia and went on, you know, farther north?
There is. I'm trying to remember. The Historical Society has quite a few artifacts, and some of it has to do with his record keeping. So there may be some of the actual ledgers and record books that he has. If not, I'm sure Philadelphia may have access to that. And it's interesting because we talk about John Jones and his record keeping of the Confederate soldiers who died, and he was meticulous in taking the information and recording it. And it was used years later to help Southern families identify and realize where their loved ones had been buried because of their record keeping. So that was an important skill to have, because there was just so much going on and a lot of relocation for families. The Still family started out as Steele as their last name, and when they were able to come further north, they decided to change to Still. And there were a lot of people who also had the name Still. So part of it was just to camouflage who they were and throw people off task, off the track of trying to capture them and take them back to the South. But names and record keeping, dates, all of that was just so crucial to what was going on. Are there others?
very much. Very interesting. I'd like to remind everybody that the books are over here for you if you would like. And I would like to let everybody know about our schedule. We have some copies of the schedule for this season. Our next book review is going to be October 6th. It's going to be a review of Shadow Divers, the true adventure of two Americans who risked everything to solve one of the last mysteries of World War II, by Robert Curson, reviewed by Mary Ann Monroe. So that'll be our next Friday book review. So thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.